Rule number 9 for better poker is call the turn with a 5-out bluff catcher. We begin this hand by smoking a cigarette. I don't smoke in real life anymore, so this is the only way I can feel cool these days. Isn't it wild that like kids that are being born today will probably like never smoke for the most part? I mean, it's great, but it's also kind of wild for our generation's point of view. Anyway, squeeze from a weaker player here. This rule is called call the turn with a 5-out bluff catcher. Generally speaking, a bluff catcher is a hand that beats all bluffs or is significantly far ahead of all bluffs but doesn't beat any value hands. That's the Carrot Poker School definition. And a 5-out bluff catcher is one like this that can improve 2 8s and 3 7s, and those outs are very, very strong here. They're great outs as long as villain doesn't have a boat already, a set already, rather. So on the turn here, nothing much changes. We get pot odds that are not amazing but also not terrible here when we face this bet. This bet can still be some bluffs from pre-flop like ace, queen, ace, 10, ace, 5, etc. It can also just be like ace, king, aces, pocket jacks, but there's not a ton of value hands here. I mean, okay, there are, but there's also a ton of bluffs here too. And very often, like at 3 to 1, what's going to happen here is that enough of the time, you're going to bink an 8 or a 7 and win a huge pot, or you're going to just call the river, bricks, villain checks back ace, queen, and you win. Those two things occur enough of the time that for 3 to 1, you should be making this call. But I see a lot of students fold here because they're like, I can't call 2. I can only call 1 with third pair, not a good enough hand to call 2, only 1. And they're looking too much at their absolute hand strength, their hand ranking. They're not looking enough at the redraw. So even though we usually take the worst of it here and what happens in this hand is normally what happens, that we just lose, you know, there's enough going on that for 25% required pot share, we should be calling that turn every single time with this hand. But it didn't work out this time. That's poker. It can't always work out. And finally, for rule 10, which is implied odds and future fold equity both matter when you're facing a bet. Don't just think about your price when you have a draw. This is a really common beginner leak where beginning poker players say, I didn't have the odds, and they perform some literal pot odds calculation. This is the 3-bet pot, button versus small blind. This player is a reg. I think they're one of the more competent players in the pool. That doesn't say much, but they've not done anything yet that made me downgrade them to the bad reg tag. I make the bad regs brown. So if you see a brown tag, it's because you used to be yellow, but then you did something that basically implied that you didn't deserve to play the game, so you got the do not deserve to play the game brown tag. This sizing deep is not nice to face when you have this hand, and it's very easy to say I don't have the odds because I'm drawing to, let's say, 9 clubs and 3 10s that aren't clubs, so I have 12 outs times 2 is 24, 25%, something like that. And to call a near pot size bet, I need like 31, 32% equity. So if you have that calculation, you end up folding here, and that's a gargantuan error, guys. It's a really, really colossal mistake, because there's a few other things going on. When villain has aces or kings or queen X, which is what they're repping for value, and you hit a 10 or a club, you win more money on the river a pretty big amount of the time. It doesn't just stop there. Villain doesn't check fold ace queen on the river because you might have a flush, especially if they have an ace of clubs blocker, but they don't anyway, genuinely. What happens in other branches of the tree here, and this is the branch people forget all about, is that if villain checks the river, they are very, very often check folding. Because if they have a queen or aces or kings, they're going to value bet again for the most part, especially with the queen. And if they have aces or kings, they might not even check call, but they probably will if they do check, but they might not check. So for the most part, if villain checks the river, they have give ups like ace 10, jack 10, ace king, etc. And we can just bet and take this pot down really, really often. So that's called future fold equity. The first part is called implied odds. Your pot odds matter as well, but the way to think about this is that you have about 25% equity here against non-boats and non-quads, and then you don't need that much more to get up to like the 32% to call, and the implied odds and the future fold equity give you that boost to bridge the gap between your equity and your required EV to call. So remember that when it's pre-river, you're looking at EV, not equity. You're not just like doing some very basic math calculation. You're actually computing all these other factors that are to do with the fact that there's still money left behind and action still to come here. So that's very important. We don't have to bluff when we river the 9 because there's not much fold equity from better hands now. And I think check is clearly the winning play. And villain has ace 4 clubs, so we got very lucky there. We were drawing insanely dead. However, I think we still win this hand quite a lot even against this hand, because in the real world we have loads of action still to come. 6 clubs are out, only 7 remain in the deck, and when villain checks the river with this busted flush draw, as they inevitably will because people don't like bluffing this sort of combo, we just bet and we win. So even though we're quote unquote dead, we win this pot a ton because we have position and because we have that future fold equity, and that's why it's so important not to get sucked into the I don't have the odds fallacy, where you're ignoring the factors that matter just as much. Implied odds, future fold equity.